Okay, so we are live now. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2020 IFF Boston Fall Focus, and welcome to this Q&A for Zappa. My name is Brian Tam. I'm the Executive Director at IFF Boston. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here to watch this. We have a couple of guests with us, and I'd like to introduce them now. We're joined by the Director of Zappa, Alex Winter. He is a director, a writer, a producer. You may know him as an actor. Best as he most recently reprised his role as Bill S. Preston Esquire in Bill and Ted Face the Music. He's also a prolific filmmaker. He directed the cult classic Freaked, and he's directed many documentaries. His documentary Downloaded played at IFF Boston in 2013, so we're very happy to have him back at the festival, and welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Good to be here, or there, or wherever we are.
And here to moderate the discussion is our good friend, Jason Gorber. Jason is the managing editor of That Shelf. He's also written for numerous other outlets. Festival goers may recognize him from his many appearances moderating Q&As at the festival, including Loose, which was last year's opening night film. So we're always excited to have Jason here. Also, anyone who watched the Minari Q&A, it was Jason that hooked us up with Paul from Kim's Convenience. So thank you for that, Jason, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. It's so great to be back.
As you can tell by Jason's background, Jason has quite the Zappa history, so we're glad to have him here. So in a minute, I'm just going to set him loose for he and Alex to talk a bit. If you're watching this live and you have any questions on YouTube, you can go to the chat panel that's on your left, put in questions, and then I will get to them after a bit. And if there are no questions, we'll just keep let these guys talking. So I guess with that, Jason, I'll hand it off to you.
Alex, congratulations on the film. It was obviously an enormous challenge to put it all together and to get everything put into place. Just wondering if you could talk about the 5-year journey of bringing this story to the big screen.
Sure. I'll try not to have this answer take 5 years. Yeah. I mean, it's by far the most challenging thing that I've done. And it's going on 6 years now, unbelievably. Look, my producer Glenn Zipper and I were looking to do something coming off of this film Deep Web that we all did together that was quite heavy, and I'd been sort of immersed in the world of the political end of the dark web and the internet and federal criminal trials, and we were wondering really why no one had done a doc about Zappa. It's the kind of I mean, I'm a Zappa fan, obviously, but it was the kind of character that I love to tell stories about. So we, quickly figured out that Gail Zappa, his widow, was in control of all rights, and Gail, her reputation had preceded her. She was a sort of a titan in the independent record scene from the 60s to present day. Amazing force of nature, but was famous for telling people no. So I pitched her a take on telling the story, not really thinking she was going to say yes. And she liked it, and she liked it so much that we kind of developed a friendship fairly quickly. And then she said, you can have access to the vault. And the vault was floor to ceiling material that Zappa had been curating, that went all the way back to before his birth, and then everything up until his death. So it was just this vast store of film and video and audio, but it was in the stuff that the family really didn't know what to do with was in some state of disrepair. A lot of that was ephemera. So we then did a Kickstarter campaign, raised an enormous amount of money, very gratefully, and spent 2 years just preserving archival media. It was this incredibly complicated process that my whole team and I embarked on, and then after that we went and got the money to make the documentary. So it's been a very long road, very gratifying, but not in any way easy, all the way up until trying to release this thing during COVID.
One of the things about Frank, obviously, is that, I mean, it mentions in the film that there's sort of two kinds of fans. There's sort of the casual fans that really like the jokey music and were there for a good time. And there's a slightly more, shall we say, esoteric or intellectual fan that was really seeing it. For me, that's what makes Frank great. It's a guy who loved Louis as much as he loved Verez and ionization. For you, what drew you to Frank, and what allowed you to tell the story both for casual fans or people who might never have even heard of him, and also for the rabid lunatics?
I think that my journey with Zappa was multifaceted, which isn't surprising considering who he was, unless you just put on apostrophe and you kind of begin and end there, meaning sort of his 70s heyday rock phase thing. But look, I'm a child of the 70s, and I first saw Zappa on SNL, like many people. My older brother and his friends were all playing Zappa, in their garage clubhouses. But my induction into Zappa was really more as a cultural figure. He was in the same pantheon as Pryor and Carlin and other people who strode sort of the boundaries of culture and politics and sort of the sexual revolution and views on morality. And that was really what sparked me about him when I was young. I didn't really get Zappa's music to the degree that you're talking about until after college. And I think I bumped on him because I didn't really know the way in as the kind of rock god he was being presented culturally at the time. After college, I realized, oh, he's not a rock and roll musician at all. That's my own opinion, I guess. But he's really more of an avant-garde composer. And that was really my take to Gale, was that I felt that Zappa was this extraordinary artist who was using all these different types of things to make his art and all these different genres, and was at kind of conflict with himself and the times and the sort of cultural peers. And that was really the story that I wanted to tell.
One of the things that he always talked about was conceptual continuity, how everything from the most banal sort of shout out at a concert about poodles to some 25-minute guitar solo just became this part of a grand central narrative. Now your film, by being authorized and by being done sort of through the archive vaults, through the restoration, you become part of that conceptual continuity. Could you talk about the responsibility of doing that and still being able to tell the story sort of warts and all about this very mercurial figure?
Look, I mean, there's obviously a responsibility that you take seriously to not muck around, as Hemingway said, not to piss in your dad's beer, right? And that was definitely on my mind. But beyond that, I felt no obligation to create fan service. In fact, I really didn't want to create fan service. And that's not to disparage the fans. It's to say that the fans know Zappa inside and out. And there's a lot of material on Zappa that you can get your hands on. I really was interested in interiority. I was interested in who he was inside, what his emotional journey was. And so Mike Nichols, the editor, and I really focused on the archival media as we were pulling it in that spoke to who this man was, without trying to crack him or label him or have some didactic perspective on who he was. One of the reasons I like making documentaries is that they don't have to be didactic. They can be they can sort of get at the human condition and all of its multifaceted and often contradictory angles. Zappa is a prime subject for that kind of treatment. So we were really most interested in telling the story of his life from the inside out. And we discarded pretty much everything else that didn't tell that story. And I also was interested in telling a story and not trying to make a encyclopedic, all-encompassing. They use the words in the marketing material sometimes that this is the definitive doc on Zappa. I would say, thankfully, that Zappa is by nature not a definitive human being. And this is definitively not definitive. And that was also something that I took very seriously from the beginning, that I wasn't going to try to cram everything in. And we also took liberties all over the place. To your point about the continuity thing, we really got to play with that in a fun way. I felt that we had archival of Zappa speaking from all across time. And the way Zappa was, and I think many people are like this, he would tell a story in 1967, tell the same story again in like 1979, again in 1988, and again in 92. We would put all those together into one sentence from across time. And so in a way, we were structurally playing with some of the same themes and ideas that Zappa would play with in the sort of cut and paste way that he made music and art, was something that we wanted to convey in the way we built the film.
One thing about Zappa is obviously, he concentrated very much, he wanted to see himself as a composer, but he used lyrics in a way that often titillated and often spoke to sort of much more base things that frankly would not play for a lot of contemporary audiences. That's one of the contradictions about him. I'm wondering what you see in terms of contemporary audiences coming into a character like this, whether they can still find a way of navigating all this stuff, even if it insults some of their sensitivities.
I think it's easier from this perspective, personally, not across the board. I think that grasping the kind of 70s, the people who really stuck him in that box, the sort of, the apostrophe overnight sensation, that was the height of Zappa box. I think maybe not. I think that's a very culturally specific moment. And it's hard to kind of re-enter that moment. But I think that to Zappa's benefit, the real Zappa, the Zappa that matters, like that has real artistic significance, I think is more graspable from a distance, because I think that, and this isn't, a heady philosophical idea. This is like, for me, comes from watching my kids. I've got a 22-year-old who found Zappa completely on his own via YouTube. And I didn't ever play him a Zappa album. And he was like, when I mentioned I was doing this film way, way, way back when he would have been 16 or 17, he's like, yeah, I love Hot Rats, but I also love The Yellow Shark. Like, because of technology and because of the way people absorb culture now, it's flattened, right? And sometimes to the detriment of culture, as we all know, but sometimes to its benefit. And I think that these sort of multi-hyphenate Gen Zers and millennials have an easier time breaking past pigeonholes and just being like, this is a guy who made a lot of cool stuff. And some of it was classical, some of it was on this electronic thing, and some of it was kind of rock oriented, and some of the lyrics were wacky and some weren't. And I don't think that they have the same prejudices that were sort of baked in by the way my culture, the analog culture, everything was so unbelievably compartmentalized. I remember going into record stores in the 80s and 90s, and it was just like one classification after the other, and everything was wedged into those little areas that were classified as X, Y, or Z. And those days are over, thankfully.
That being said, a lot of people sort of silo themselves, particularly on social media and elements like this. What your film does remarkably well, it shows not only the diversity of Frank and his career, but also the diversity of opinion he presented. I mean, one, I guess it's a famous quote, I'm not racist, I hate everyone equally. I mean, it's that sort of the polyglot way of his ability to offend, to be provocative in the true sense. Yeah. All of these divides, I'm wondering about navigating that, but more importantly, you're somebody who does fiction films and you do documentary. You're somebody who speaks, again, to audiences that know the stuff and people that don't. People will ascribe to you particular motivations or intentions based on what you write on Twitter, but then maybe something different about what you actually engage with in your films. I'm wondering if you could talk yourself about maybe both the opportunities and frustrations of making art for a group that on the one hand can have access to everything, on the other hand seem nuances lost for a lot of people who want things very black and white.
I think that it motivated me to make documentaries. I think that I spent decades in narrative and was quite frustrated with the even the independent film scene was very biased, very compartmental. Politically, you had to ride a certain line. The stories had to be about a certain type of hero or anti-hero or antagonist. I identify with Zappa in a kind of inherent suspicion and aversion to movements, even movements that may appear to be on my political side of the spectrum. It's just the way I'm wired, and maybe the culture in which I grew up. Documentaries were very liberating for me, and it started with Downloaded, which was at this festival, which I had spent 10 years trying to make as a narrative, and I had it set up at a major studio, and I wrote many drafts, and then I spent years out in the indie movie wilderness trying to get it made. And mostly what prevented me from getting it made was bias. Either the rabid anti-technology bias on the indie scene, or the sort of more of a political bias in other areas, like, oh, this was the privacy person, and this is the person who created piracy, and we have to hang them from the nearest tree and all of this stuff. And the story I was trying to tell was not black or white. And it was very hard to write that into a narrative, because narratives by nature is somewhat didactic, but the sort of market for narrative is also very, very biased. And the doc just liberated me completely. It allowed me to just tell a story without having to worry about whether these people were heroes or villains, and look at the other side without having to worry about whether they were heroes and villains. And look, it was open to interpretation. Like you said, someone's gonna, people would watch that movie and be like, oh, you were being overly supportive of the tech people, or they'd watch it and say the opposite. And that's fine. I mean, I don't need people to respond to my work, a certain way, but I certainly want to know that I was able to convey it that way. So I think documentaries, the boom of docs has been great. I think that for me personally, technology is better at nuance, actually, in terms of what it's done culturally than the inverse. I think it was much easier to stay in your little box in the old days. I think that there are people who approach technology in a very siloed way. And yes, if you do that, then you can very easily, shut out the noise floor of anyone who disagrees with you. But if you're open at all, technology allows you to let in a lot of voices very safely. And I discovered that way, way back in the BBS and using that era of technology in the 80s, that I could engage with people who I had incredible differing opinions with, people who were sometimes just straight up fascist, but I was able very safely in that community to engage with those people and get into discourse in a way that I never could before technology had these kind of open communities.
My God, I think you're actually an optimist. It's quite impressive. Given that optimism,
politically, cool thing to talk about technology with anything other than disparagement at the moment.
Right.
But,
if you could talk about the participants, you brought in these obviously people who knew and worked with Frank intimately. For me, the most remarkable, as somebody who is a big fan, but also that I can now point to showcase, the interviews with Ruth is fantastic, because she literally posits him being genius asshole and asshole genius, and both of those things can be true at the same time. We could talk about bringing the participants and those who contributed, and maybe some that were maybe a little bit more reluctant.
Look, every documentary that's the question, right? Who do you want? Who are you going to get? And who do you need, right? And those are often very different things. And I really learned that by having made quite a few at this point, as early as I am in the sort of my career of making documentaries, that you usually end up with what you need, if you're open. You may not get all the people that you want, and you may get some people that you wanted that aren't very good, it turns out, for whatever reason. They don't have anything to say, they won't open up. With this documentary, I was very, very specific about who I went after. And I was only interested in people that had a very deep, long-running understanding of Zappa's interior life, which is really what I was after. I wanted insight into his interior. I didn't just want people talking about how influential he was. I didn't want people who only knew him later in life, or who maybe didn't know his mind or his heart that well. So I went after people who I believed would really be able to speak to his interior life. And thankfully, I was able to find enough of those people to get what I needed. Ruth is a prime example. David Lynch has a great quote about finding the eye of the duck, right? It's sort of that one moment, that one element of your narrative or of your work that allows it to just turn into a duck. And without the eye on the duck, it's not a duck, right? Ruth is my eye of the duck.
And look, Ruth manages to humanize in a really beautiful way the most complex, the most intellectual, the most obnoxious thing Frank ever wrote.
Yeah.
Her performance along with Joe is astonishing. You can just show somebody that and say, that's beautiful music. And then you realize it was written as a torture test in order to hire new drummers and get a bunch of instrumentalists and just drive Basio to the point of madness. I mean, all of this, you don't need to know other than just to see the beauty. And for me, this is what worked so well with the film. Did you show the film to people who didn't know who the hell Frank was? And what was their response to this? Do you see this as the introduction for people who might not know any of this stuff going on?
I mean, it wasn't made for that reason, but I'm not, I'm not callous enough to think that I didn't want it to have that. I wanted, part of me wanted it to be enjoyable by anybody, including people who don't like Zappa's music, because I find him such an extraordinary individual who lived at extraordinary times. So there's really a lot there for people to grab onto, even if they hate him. If they hate him or they hate the music, I still think it's an extraordinary story. So, yes, I did want it to serve to some degree as a way into someone who may be problematic for people to get into, but I also really wanted to convey the difficult beauty of this particular artist, sort of as you said, that like I didn't want a lot of people playing Zappa's music in this film. And at the end, I really only had two entities doing it, Ruth and Joe, and then Kronos, and for very specific reasons. And with Ruth, it's you're absolutely right. I really want, at the end of the day, she can convey as much as she wants by talking. Where the rubber meets the road is with the art. And when she plays that piece on the piano, it is so moving. We were all in tears, and a lot of my crew didn't know Zappa at all, and some of them didn't like him at all. But there wasn't a dry eye on our set. It was just it's a beautiful piece of music, beautifully played. And yes, I did all through the edit process, Mike and I would show our work to people who didn't know Zappa at all. That was very important to us to see if the story and the arc and the journey was working on people who had no experience with that prior.
Given the fact that it's Halloween, which is a very Zappa day at the best times, so there's a wonder way of celebrating it. Equally, we're in the midst of a political season down. I understand, I'm Canadian, but I understand you guys are having an election coming up. I've heard something.
I better get on that.
How would Frank be responding to all of this? Everything from COVID to the election to social media to all of it. Do you see his voice, the absence of his voice, as being just another thing that we've lost with the loss of him at so young?
Of course. I mean, it would be fantastic to have him now. The great thing about Zappa being iconoclastic is that and being anti-movement, right? Not being a part of very radically different types of movements in his day. He was opposed to the San Francisco scene. He was opposed to the hippie scene in LA. He was opposed to the kind of what he saw as the pretentious New York art scene. He really wasn't even going for or allowing himself to feel comfortable within what would have been pretty simpatico scenes, much less the sort of outright fascist things that were going on in the 60s and 70s and ultimately in the 80s. So I find this a little amusing now because I'm sort of in Zappa land, how everyone in that world assumes they know what Zappa would be saying today, right? They all feel they've got, the libertarians have claimed him, the conservatives have claimed him, the left wing has claimed him. And so I would never presume to suggest what Zappa would do. The only thing I can say that is consistent in his political views was anti-fascism and a deep-seated belief in the right to vote. So that tells you a lot, I think, about what he'd be saying about what's happening in America right now as far as the threat to citizens' ability to vote, voter suppression, fascist tendencies in many areas of our country. That's about as far as I'll go. But there was never anything in his rhetoric in his entire life, even before he became overtly political, that suggested he would stand by and let those things go.
I think that the film actually draws a correlation. He does, in fact, with Prince. Another person who also had a fight with Warner, another person who fought to get his music back, another person who sort of set up his studio in his home. The correlations are there in massive ways. They both changed music. They both had incredible musicians they fired. We can check it off. The difference is that Frank went in front of the Senate and argued for his positions, and Prince very much became distance. In some ways, we're drawn closer to somebody like Prince because we don't know as much about him, and someone like Frank, since he was so overt and had so much to say, that people have sometimes dismissed his ideas. Just wondering if, for you as an artist and as a public figure and all of this stuff, how do you navigate all that? Are you ever concerned that you're giving too much of yourself away based on what you actually present and what you promote?
Yeah, I've given that quite a bit of thought, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to make this documentary. Is I have deep disdain for the moral cowardice of not speaking up in order to preserve your brand.
Right.
And I really do. I think it's unconscionable. And the notion of standing on the sidelines while horrific acts are taking place that you have the ability to have some say in and not doing anything, I think is unconscionable. So to me, one of the things I always loved about Zappa, even when I was young, was his ardent demystifying of the rock and roll world. He can even his own brand, his own sort of mystified image, he would constantly tear that down. And I was always I always admired that a great deal. I think that, did it lose on some people? Sure, maybe it did. But at the end of the day, I think he was most concerned about making work that mattered to him and that he felt had sort of an integrity within his own artistic values. And I do not believe that being open and talking and demystifying your own BS in any way invalidates your art. So it's really a question of the marketplace. And you can look at fascist uprisings in the past, or you can look at the blacklist, or you can look at other times where people compromise themselves. And I think history wisely doesn't look too kindly on those people in the rearview mirror.
From the outside as a fan, but one of the things that your film does is shows the vault. This famous, obviously Joe's there, the Vaultmeister. You get to go in there, and we actually get Frank giving us a tour of that. What was the one thing that you found in there that you're like, oh my God, this has to be in this movie? And what is the one thing you found in there like, oh my God, I wish this could be in this movie, but it's just not right for it?
Oh gosh, there was a lot of all of the above. And there was stuff that I wish could be in the movie, but it would have just deteriorated too much to get, or it was like a few frames and then it just went or just disappeared. We'd find like a little bit of film and it wouldn't be enough to use. I would get there'd be a box marked Hendrix, and then you'd spend like $8,000 to preserve whatever that was because you couldn't see it. And it was about to deteriorate and it'd be like some fuzzy shot of the back of Hendrix's head at Royal Albert Hall. I mean, it was a hunt and peck mission. The stuff that I love the most is it's not the least interesting to the average person, but I love the ephemera. I love the stuff that, him and Don Van Vliet hanging out, shot on Super 8, hanging out, listening to blues records in high school. I love all the footage of the Garrick Theater.
Captain Beefheart, by the way, for those who are.
Captain Beefheart. Yep. The Garrick is an era of Zappas that I actually grilled Gail about in our early discussions. It was a part of his life that I was very interested in. It's a very uncommon artistic experience to be able to take over a small theater, an actual theater, and just hang out there day in, day out, and just either play or put on shows or just talk. And he really formed his artistic identity there. And it's during an amazing time in New York City's cultural history. So there were things like that I really gravitated towards. There was a lot of stuff that was really great that I didn't use because it was just more fan service. I mean, there's masters down there of him playing the bicycle on the Steve Allen Show. I'm sure the fans would love to see that. It's all over YouTube. I really didn't want to get into it. But look, I'm not where the buck stops. I mean, we were able to preserve a bunch of stuff. There was way more footage there than we used. There will be a future Ken Burns that makes a 10-part series on Zappa, which absolutely needs to happen, that will use all of this stuff. So I also didn't feel like I was obligated to have I wasn't so greedy with the material that I thought I'm going to mine I'm not going to leave anybody any gold, I was like, there's plenty of gold there still to work with, and people will work. I mean, it's Zappa. They'll work with it.
To your point about Ken Burns, obviously, the Beatles got an entire anthology. Surely Frank, with 60-something records during his lifetime, could have 50 hours of footage. Nonetheless, if you could talk about documentarians or documentaries specifically that shaped you as a filmmaker, but also shaped your ability to tell this type of narrative, where you are, again, doing a very fine line between being introductory and giving people things that they maybe weren't expecting. Beautiful shots of the Garrick, as you mentioned, beautifully restored, that anybody who knows that footage has seen it horribly before, getting to see it in new and beautiful ways. Navigating all that and other films that allowed you to structure the film in a particular way.
The films that have always had the biggest influence on me making docs, or things that I saw at pivotal times in my life. Robert Frank's Cocksucker Blues is one of my very, very favorite, and probably one of the most impactful things on me artistically in this space, even when I'm not making, archivally oriented. Just the way he has a presence without becoming didactic within that space is very, very hard to do. I mean, I love his photography as well. And I was a photo minor at NYU and a film major. So I got a lot of good study of that type of photography at that time. That was very impactful to me. Zappa really allowed me to utilize those influences. Pennebaker, obviously. There are so many great, I mean, even what Koppel did with Harlan County, is sort of how you engage with sort of historical situations and how you convey those things. Zappa is a gold mine because it's all of that stuff. It's, he's in Prague, and he's at the heart of the sexual revolution. And there's this amazing, it's how we approach the archival, was trying to create atmosphere out of the archival, not just show some cool piece of footage from yesteryear. So I mean, there was a lot there, and then there's obviously great modern doc filmmakers that have been very influential for me, who I'm always thinking about when I'm working.
Hey, Alex, we've got some questions from the audience, so I'll throw those out to you if that's cool.
Sure.
All right. So there's a number of questions here talking about the vaults. So tying into what you were just talking about, someone's asking if there's any hidden gems that you found going through the vaults that you couldn't put in that you maybe wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that I wanted to. Everything we wanted to, we put in. And if it really was in disrepair, sometimes we'd put it in anyway, and we would just sort of adjust the footage around it so it wouldn't be so, garish on the eyes. But there was nothing really down there. I mean, I would have loved to have found more of the stuff with Joni Mitchell. I was really hunting for that. I mean, I love Joni Mitchell, but also just because of that period, more in Laurel Canyon, I would have loved to have found. There's stuff. My answer is that there's stuff that isn't there that I really was hoping to find more on the Tom Mix, the Log Cabin era, which is when like Mick Jagger was hanging out, and it was really conveyed how Zappa was at the absolute forefront of the Laurel Canyon movement, which is often neglected as a fact. But it just wasn't there. So, Pam DeBar thankfully gave me a great run on it, and she was there. But there was a lot of stuff I wanted to find that I couldn't find. Thankfully, it was an embarrassment of riches, and there was a lot there that I was able to find.
Was there any unreleased work that you got to hear that maybe you could elaborate on for the fans?
Honestly, not. It's not. I mean, it's traditionally not a music doc, and it's certainly not a concert film. So I had access to the vault, and Joe Travers, who's the vault meister, who has done, Gail had done an incredible job of vault preservation in the 20 some odd years since Frank's death. And the Zappa Trust had been releasing all this material, and they continue to release material. And Joe has, they have original mixing boards. I mean, they're painstaking about how they handle Zappa's world and getting that music out to people in the way that is. So they've been pretty good at fan service. There's some goodies. When I was doing the Kickstarter, we were feeding the backers on updates some of the stuff that was coming down the road. And so I got to hear a lot of stuff that's fantastic. Oh, I've got one. And I tried to figure out a way to get this in the movie. A discovery that I made, this is a little film nerdy, but this is a film festival. Discovery that I made that no one had heard and the family wasn't even aware of, was Zappa had created a score for The Fly on Synclavier the year that Cronenberg was making The Fly. And it is fantastic. Now, I'm a huge fan of his more avant-garde classical stuff, because that's just stuff I've loved since I was really young. And it's very Albert Eiler, Schoenbergy. I mean, it's really dissonant. And I don't even think he ever gave it to Cronenberg, because you can see why it would never have worked. But he's like sampling fly sounds and like working that in orchestrally to the music. And it's absolutely amazing. And I'm hoping that the Zappas release that at some point. But that was like a holy crap moment. And then I went to Howard.
You know how I can get that to David. He lives a couple blocks away. You just send me the files. We will make it happen.
Well, we went to Howard Shore. We went to people who worked with David, and we're like, did you ever hear this? Did he ever present this to anyone? And they were all like, as far as we know, Cronenberg never got this and didn't know it existed. So it wasn't like they'd had some communication, but it's really beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful music, and I would love to see that whole thing released at some point.
To that end, there's a question if there's any chance now that so much of the work that you worked on was digitized, is there any chance that more of the vault will be seen that's outside of the stock?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, what we did was, look, you know, I'm an indie filmmaker. This was not either financed or even controlled by the Zappas. This was me and my like tiny handful of staff from the very beginning all the way through to the end. And you know, we raised all this money because of the backers. We raised over $1 million, and we archived an enormous amount of material. And then we went and archived more that wasn't in disrepair, and we ended up putting all of that on LTO archival tape. And the family is going to be, it's either going to go to a university or the Smithsonian. Like they're working on those arrangements, but it will absolutely get out in front of scholars and the public and whatever. No one is holding that back. And it's not even that commercial. So it's not as if the family's gonna be like, great, we're gonna, you know, release a movie of like Zappa's, you know, apartment films from 1969, you know. But it really should be seen. And it's a great window into an artist.
So we have a question here about the CZECH situation. If there's anything about that situation that you had to leave out, I don't know if they mean politically or just for time or.
Yeah, there was. I mean, you know, it's an incredible story. And we left out, we cut it, but it really just got too long. We left out a whole aspect of that story of how Zappa was blacklisted because he had gone after so many powerful political people and their wives, who were, you know, a big part of who put the committee together for, you know, towards censorship, which Tipper Gore was a part of, but, you know, so was, you know, a lot of people on the right, and the right was in power through that whole period, through the Reagan era and beyond into the Bush era. And they made life very difficult for Frank. And he had trouble with radio airplay because of it. And he had trouble with record sales because of it. And a lot of that was due to very powerful people in Reagan and Bush administrations who were mad at him for the success he had in the Senate hearings. Tipper Gore and Al Gore actually apologized, which is pretty well known. You can look that up on Wikipedia. But and they ended up becoming like they buried the hatchet. But he had a lot of problems that were specifically due to being blacklisted.
Let's see. So, you know, I think this, you know, Jason was talking about Gail's kind of, you know, noting that, you know, Zappa was both a genius and an asshole. And so one of the questions asking was like, what part of the duality in his personality spoke to you?
Well, I'm not really a genius, so I guess it's the other part. Look, the thing that, you know, I remember talking is I'm a huge Lou Reed fan, right? And I'm from New York, and Lou Reed was my whole world for and still is to a degree, probably more than almost any other artist. Lou Reed was an asshole, right? And you know, there were huge feuds between New York and LA and Zappa and the Warhols and the Velvets and all of this stuff. I'm only mentioning it because some of that was performative, in my opinion, and was just cranky kind of BS. And some of that was like, you know, Zappa and Lou Reed, to be honest with you, had to fight like hell in order to make the art that they wanted to make. And they had to fight with everybody from within and without. And, you know, you don't end up with these sort of revolutionary artist types or revolutionary political types who are nice people, because they're fighting all the time. And that will you either are that person from the beginning, or it will turn you into that person. And I just don't think there's any way around that. I think that often, you know, we want our revolutionaries to be the types of people that they're just never going to be. And one of the things you learn, you know, in you know, as you get older, is that most of those people are assholes.
I'm going to jump in super quickly. Obviously, Lou Reed went on to induct Frank into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So
I could talk about that for a very long time, but yeah, that is, I've got good juice from that with Gail that I think we are going to put out as an extra, because it's pretty good.
How did your reaction to Frank's music change from making this film?
Look, going in, my thesis, to the degree that I have one about him artistically, was not that he was misunderstood or anything, because Frank Zappa didn't need me to come along and clear up the record or anything like that. But his music does that, I think, very well. But I did feel that that he had been kind of dismissed culturally, and misunderstood, and it just gotten kind of put, by the sort of old legacy kind of world, like sort of the reference I made earlier, that a lot of the young generation wasn't so boxed in there. They could listen to the classical and the rock or whatever. And I remember when I pitched it to Gail, I was like, the aha moment for me musically was Zappa, that he wasn't a rock and roll musician at all. And but the thing I really learned making the film that I didn't have substantially in my head going in was that he really is very revered by the classical community. That he is not dismissed by them. That he is not. That they really hold him in incredibly high regard, and they really view him as one of the 20th century's great classical composers, as David Harrington says in our film from Kronos. And Kronos is a really good example. And this was a learning curve for me, because I really wanted them to play None of the Above, the very short piece that Zappa wrote for Kronos Quartet in like the mid 80s, because it doesn't exist anywhere. And I thought that would be a great way to sort of convey that he was always writing this kind of music. It wasn't something he just did because he got old and boring, right? And I went to Kronos and I said, I would love for you guys to play None of the Above, and I'll film you playing it. It won't take you very long. It's only 2 minutes long. And Harrington's response was, yes, I'll do it, but I need you to just call us back in a year. And I was like, what, are you that busy? He goes, no, it's that hard to play. He says, it's so hard to play. And I refused, I don't want any of us to screw it up, that around our schedule, we're going to need a year to get it right. And I literally, the film took so long to make, I literally waited a year, and a full year later, I had it on my calendar, like, ping, and I called, their reps back, and I was like, can we do it? And they were like, they're just about ready. And it really did. It took over a year for them to get it together. 2 minutes, that piece. So I didn't have that sense going in, of the degree of the level of artistry he was operating at as an avant-garde composer.
So we have a question about, so while you were making this doc, another doc came out called Eat That Question, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, I believe. I'm assuming you saw it, did that have any impact on what you were doing, or did you kind of see that as a separate project?
No, but I'm like this on every doc. I'm one of these people that doesn't believe it. I mean, I know the market, it can be hard on the market. From a directing standpoint, I don't believe in exclusivity on anything. Even when I'm like doing political docs, I don't like lock up my subject for exclusivity. I tend to believe if a story is worth telling, the more of them we have, the better. Like the more voices we have. I mean, it's Frank Zappa. There should be 40 documentaries about Frank Zappa. They would all be completely different. Like, I'd love to see one that focused on just he and Gail's relationship. Amazing story. I'd love to see something that just delved into sort of his arc as a musician. What I loved about Eat That Question was that it took a lot of material that was already out in the world, but it very artistically crafted a narrative just from the public facing Zappa. That's a great idea. I love that movie for that. Our movie there could not be more different. So, and I'm happy that that's in the world and that there are other sort of ways into Zappa that are in the world. And for God's sakes, I want there to be more going forward.
All right. Well, I guess to start to wrap up, I want to let everyone know who's watching this. If you haven't had a chance to watch Zappa yet, we are screening it at the Fall Focus. You can watch it through 10 a.m. November 2nd on Monday. So if you haven't yet or you want to watch it again, please do that. And Alex, I know Magnolia has the distribution. Do you know what the plan is after it does its festival run?
Yeah. I mean, could not be happier that that's where we are. That is such a great home, and they're doing an incredible job. And with COVID, it was really hard to put all that together. So we're doing a very robust festival run, which is obviously largely online. Then we're doing a one-night theatrical event, which I believe is on November 23rd, which will be followed by, available everywhere VOD for all of North America. International is not Magnolia, so that's going to roll out later. We're working on that now for the rest of the world. but really on November 27th, Franksgiving, we're calling it. You'll be able to see the film pretty much anywhere if you're in North America.
That's right. So Jason, do you have a final question you'd like to add to wrap things up?
Can you think of another artist that you would ever devote this much of your life towards?
I mean, probably Lou Reed. I would be so happy, but you know what? It would be bad for me to do when I met with Gail, she was like, "I love you because you got a really good sense of who he was, but you're not a fanatic, right?" I'm a little bit of a Lou Reed fanatic, so I'm probably not the right guy to make the Lou Reed doc.
And I lied. One more question. For people who are coming in, Bears, the normal Zappa question, give me 5 records in order that people should dig in to actually get a sense of the man musically.
Ooh, 5? I mean, honestly, I could give you 2. I think if you go Hot Rats on one end and Yellow Shark on the other, they're 2 of the greatest albums made in that period of our musical history. They're very different, and they're also Zappa. I mean, in between those, you can't go wrong with Apostrophe. You can't go wrong with Joe's Garage. There are so many, Freak Out, I highly recommend. And then some of the Synclavier stuff, the End of Civilization stuff, and Drowning Witch. But I really jump onto Hot Rats on one end and Yellow Shark on the other. There's beautiful stuff in there, and if you can get on that bicycle and ride without falling off, I think you're going to be fine with the rest of it.
I need to have one live album, so I'm going to suggest Live at the Fillmore. We could do Roxy, but Live at the Fillmore we got to include.
Yeah, Roxy would be highly. And the movie, it's another great Zappa doc. The Roxy documentary is probably the closest you can get to really feeling the Zappa experience. It's incredibly well made out of material that was a mess. So it's like a work of doc genius, that thing.
Alex, thank you so much. The film was fantastic, and it's such a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Alex. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Check out Zappa. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Music is the best.